Hello, this week's parsha is Vayetze. It continues the story of the life of Yaakov. We left Yaakov fleeing from Esau, his brother, to avoid his wrath after the episode of the brachas. He is en route to Mesopotamia, where he's going to marry and have children and spend many years before finally facing his brother in next week's parsha. En route, the sun sets unexpectedly. He has to go to sleep in an unprotected place, and he dreams of a ladder. And that dream of a ladder says very profound things about Yaakov, his destiny, his journey. But I want to focus on a detail which has led to a children's story, what appears to be a fable, but in fact contains some really fascinating and profound ideas. Vayifga b'makom, he's en route and he encountered the place. Vayolen shom kivo hashemesh, and he lay down there to sleep because the sun had set. It seems that he miscalculated, or the rabbis say the sun miraculously set, so that he should end up lying in the place which turns out to be where the Akedah was performed. Vayikach me'avnei makom, he took from the stones of the place, Vayosim merashe sov, and he set them for his head, Vayishkab b'makom ahu, and he lay down for the night and went to sleep in that place. Now the phrase Vayikach me'avnei makom, he took from the stones of the place, he set them as a kind of barrier, Rashi explains, to protect himself from animals because it's not really a sleeping place. Rashi understands that me'avnei makom is plural, more than one stone, and that's why it's a barrier. The Ibn Ezra assumes that it really means just one stone of the stones of the place, but we'll go with Rashi because it seems to fit the language better. And Rashi realizes there is a problem, because Vayashkem Yaakov baboker, after the dream had finished, Yaakov got up early in the morning, Vayikach eso even asher marashe sov, he took the stone that he had set for his head, Vayosim oso matzevo, and he made it as a monument, Vayitzok shemen al rosho, and he poured oil on its top to kind of inaugurate it as a monument. You'll immediately notice there is a disparity. It begins with stones plural, but when he gets up in the morning there's a single stone. And this gives rise, resolving this contradiction, gives rise to this fable, which appears in a couple of versions in the Midrash. But Rashi quotes most famously, the stones squabble, Olay yoniach tzadik rosho. I want the tzaddik, the righteous man Yaakov, to put his head on me, and they squabble, and God, to avoid this squabble, amalgamates them into a single stone. Hence the story begins with many stones and ends with a single stone. And I remember my children coming home from school, they have little pictures, all kinds of stories about the stones squabbling and eventually amalgamating, unifying into a single stone. This Rashi is based on a Midrash, and the Midrash amplifies the story and begins to give us a more mature and perhaps more sophisticated way of understanding the story. I think first of all one should say it does not need to be taken literally. I think the Rambam would view taking something of this sort literally as very strange. But in the end, it doesn't matter whether the story is intended to be taken literally. What is important is what it means. And that can sometimes be lost in the details. A clever children's story that one never forgets. But what does it actually mean? So the Midrash says, Yaakov is going through, let's say, a thought process, what we might today call an existential crisis. He asked the following question, I suppose musing. He asked the question, who am I? Am I just another link in the chain? Avram passed to Yitzchak, who passed to me, but we've not yet built the backbone of a people, the tribes which will become the people. Or am I actually going to be the founder of the Jewish people? And we know the answer, eventually he does become the founder of the Jewish people. He adopts an individual identity, Yaakov, as well as his corporate identity, Yisrael, the founder of the Jewish people. But he's asking God, as it were, musing, what am I? Who am I? And he proposes to God the following: if I take a group of stones and they amalgamate, then I will know that I have the capacity to be the founder of the Jewish people, and that's what happens. It's curious that Rashi does not include that part in his Midrash. Perhaps he feels that isn't necessary. The maral, writing in the late 16th century in Prague, in his super commentary to Rashi, amplifies this idea. Why is it going on in Yaakov's head? Why do the stones wish Yaakov to place his head on them? Because it's a matter for the head. It's going on in his mind. This is something which is critical to Yaakov's identity. Who is he? What is he? Where is he going? As I said, we might describe this today as an existential crisis. He's asking God for clarity. Am I an individual, just the next step? Or am I part of a new reality, creating a community? And that requires a very, very delicate identity, because Yaakov is not to create a group of clones who will all be the same. That's not a people at all. Nor is he to create a group of people whose ideas and aspirations and direction are so different that it will be completely impossible for them to work together or share any kind of meaningful communal identity. Yaakov is asking a sophisticated question. Of course I can have lots of children, but is it meaningful? Will I be able to hold them all together? And of course what God is saying to him through this story, and it should be taken as an allegory, that by amalgamating or showing in his mind the stones amalgamating, he's taught a profound lesson. We are at that moment in history. We are at that point in which it's possible to move from the life of the individual and move from the life of the individual into a community that has a very particular identity, which respects individuality while still promoting a joint and shared direction. Now, if one thinks about it, this is really what the Midrash is supposed to be saying. The Midrash is teaching that there is an identity to the Jewish people, that the transition which he will experience not till next week from Yaakov to Yisrael, while still retaining the Yaakov identity, is really who we are about and what we're about. The ability to combine particularity or particularism with a universal approach, a big tent approach, while retaining our family, communal and faith identity, but in the interest of all humanity. That's the role of the Jewish people, and that will be articulated later in the Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kodesh, the idea that we will be teachers or role models for humanity, thinking about our own spiritual needs in the context of all humanity. That will play out on the larger scale, the macro scale, later on, just before the revelation at Har Sinai in the 19th chapter of Shemos. I think this maral offers a profound insight, and I think it turns a children's fable into a profound identity crisis, which is eventually resolved by God's intervention, at least in some conceptual way. But I do think it's relevant now. We find ourselves, I think, now in a transitional phase. Thank God, with the development of vaccines, it does seem that while there are many difficult months to come, and sadly probably many more illnesses and deaths, Rahman al-Islam, fortunately it does seem that there is a way forward and there is a kind of end in sight. And while we should be doing everything possible to protect ourselves and our community and our families, we should also be thinking about what the world's going to look like afterwards. And if you look at the direction that people have been going in, you can see there are people who are becoming very much focused on the individual needs. It becomes selfish, it becomes particular, I have to look after myself, and no one else matters. At the other end of the spectrum, we feel there's a sense we will have to work together in every possible way, and individuality doesn't matter anymore, and there are shared identities and shared objectives which override any particularity. Judaism very squarely lies between the two extremes. And we want to think very carefully. We have our communal, personal, religious objectives, but we have responsibilities to our community, responsibilities to the world, to be role models to humanity, social justice, dealing with inequity. Many inequities have become heightened or exacerbated by the current situation. We need to think very much about our broad responsibilities to climate and to the world, while still retaining our distinct Jewish identity. There's a transition going on from Yaakov to Yisrael, and it's a transition that the Jewish people have faced at very many stages of our national life. And it's a question that we should be all asking ourselves now as we begin to think what our personal, family, communal roles will look like when, please God, the pandemic finally comes to an end, or at least a semblance of normal life can resume. So with those thoughts in mind, Yaakov and this little story gives, I think, a profound template for what that might look like. We are sophisticated enough. Judaism has the strength to combine both. Our individual direction with a shared sense of responsibility. We can all go in the same direction, but retain our own sense of self. Good Shabbos and sei gesund stark.